Well, look, this global average temperature is now beyond anything that humans have ever experienced. And it's pushed us into a new area of worsening fire seasons, of deadly heat waves, of more extreme downpours and flooding, of more destructive cyclones. And this has brought an enormous amount of suffering to every region on Earth over the last decade. We know that this is driven by the relentless climate pollution from the burning of coal, oil, and gas, and that we are setting ourselves up for a very dangerous future indeed if we don't get our emissions plummeting this decade by moving more quickly to clean energy.
Now, 2024 was the first calendar year where the Earth exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. World leaders had tried to prevent that as part of the 2015 Paris Agreement. What does this data say about the political will to invest in curbing emissions?
Look, we have seen momentum around the world in that we're now seeing far more investment into clean energy than into fossil fuels. And look, here in Australia, we now have 40% of our main national energy grid powered by renewable energy. But of course, we have got so much more to do. We are now perilously close to crossing some very dangerous tipping points in the climate system that would be setting us up for even more of a world of pain. And the cost here really is measured in our health, in livelihoods, in lives around the world, hitting all of us. And as what we've seen with these horrific fires in Southern California, nobody is immune to the impacts of climate change. Of course, it hits the most vulnerable in our community hardest. We are making progress, but goodness, we've got a lot to do in these critical years ahead. It's the pace of emissions reductions now and through the 2020s that is going to be so decisive, that is going to make the difference between a future to which we have some hope of still thriving and adapting and one which could really overwhelm us.
So we shouldn't be looking at this data as it being too late to cut back on emissions.
Look, it's never too late. Every fraction of a degree of avoided warming matters. It doesn't just matter, it's measured in lives, entire nations, saved from a very, very bleak future. So every positive action we take now is a little investment in a better future than we would otherwise see. But we need to be looking at roughly halving global emissions this decade. Now, for Australia, that means staying the course, really building on the progress we've already made, because few countries have more skin in the game than we do. I mean, Australians are already deeply familiar with the climate whiplash, this sort of wild swings between devastating extremes that we get with climate change, from deadly heat to extreme downpour floods, fire weather, and back again. And everything we do now is going to be a future in which we can still thrive. But of course, we've also got to learn to adapt and cope with the impacts that we're already seeing and will see. So this is a decisive time, a tremendous amount of work we've got to do on every front.
Now, speaking of countries that do have a lot more skin in the game here, the analysis does highlight how rough it's been throughout Asia Pacific in particular. We've seen cyclones in Vietnam, in China, in the Philippines. There's been major flooding in Bangladesh. Just how common are these heavy rainfall events becoming?
Look, by burning coal, oil and gas, heating up the atmosphere, we've also created an atmosphere that's wetter and that's packing more energy, which is why we get that whiplash effect, why we get these wild swings from very, very hot to these extreme downpours and back again. And if we look over the last year, yes, we had a very destructive typhoon season affecting the Philippines. We've had some devastating flooding in parts of South and Southeast Asia, and we had another extraordinary heat wave going back to between March and June in India. Now, the cost of this is measured in lives and livelihoods, and whole communities really devastated. And it does drive home just how much is at stake. And we're a big player here in Australia. We're a very large producer of fossil fuels. What we choose to do now to accelerate our transition and play that responsible bigger role in the world's transition is going to make a tremendous difference to the lives and prospects of people here in Australia, but also throughout our region and around the world.
Speaking of Australia's role going forward, Australia was one of the few countries that did not experience its hottest year on record in 2024. We're now in an election year. The great nuclear debate has been bubbling away recently. What are you hoping to see from all sides of politics in terms of how to tackle climate change from here on in?
Look, it's our actions now that matter, not what the coalition may want to do in the 2040s with its nuclear power plan, but the speed of emissions reductions now. And we've made real progress with the rollout of renewable energy, which offers the path to affordable, reliable power and to a prosperous future for Australian industry. we have to stay that course because we're going to get a lot of benefit out of that for our economy. And it really is absolutely crucial that we're playing our part in driving down our own emissions, but also that we're dealing with the enormous global footprint from our fossil fuel exports. Now, Australia really is fortunate in this regard in that we are sitting on some of the world's best renewable energy potential, also various minerals that are essential to the world's energy transition. So what we've been expecting any responsible leaders to be doing at this point is to recognize the urgency of the challenge, recognize the depth of suffering here in Australia and around the world from the decades of lost inaction on climate change, and really now throwing everything we've got at this challenge, because the prize of doing that is a safer future for all communities, and then all these additional benefits where we're dealing with cost of living through lowering insurance premiums, or you've got affordable and reliable power. That is all for the taking, and that's what real leadership is going to look like, is seizing that moment and getting us firmly on the path that we need to be on.
Dr. Bradshaw, we've led tonight's bulletin with these devastating wildfires unfolding in California. At the moment, authorities have admitted they were caught completely off guard when these occurred. It's now bushfire season here in Australia, and we usually get some US firefighters coming over to help out if things kick off. Are those days essentially over now, given that fire seasons are becoming increasingly more fluid?
This is increasingly a challenge. I mean, Southern California is another very fire-prone part of the world, like here in the south of Australia, but they are having these enormously destructive fires during their winter and are now looking at fire seasons year-round. Here, our fire seasons are much longer and more dangerous and narrow windows to be reducing the amount of fuel in the landscape. Of course, this is putting tremendous strain on our emergency services. It's bringing a lot of uncertainty and genuine fear to communities. Now, our first priority has to be to get climate pollution down as far as possible this decade. But of course, we need to be adapting to the impacts that we are now seeing and will see in future. As we're seeing right now, it's proving really, really hard to cope even with the impacts we're seeing now at around 1.5, 1 to 6 degrees of warming. We've baked in a lot more impacts through our past inaction. We've got to be taking a whole range of practical measures, from improving the resilience of our infrastructure, boosting our emergency services, equipping communities with early warning systems, all the knowledge they need to be prepared for whatever's coming. So we have to do all of that, but it's action on all fronts. It's preparing for what's coming, but if we don't get our climate pollution down and play our role in that, then we will be setting ourselves up for a future to which it's going to be impossible to adapt. So there's real work to be done.
You did touch on it there slightly. One positive that the report or this analysis highlights is the improvement in warnings and disaster management, meaning that fewer people have died as a result of these disasters. Is that somewhat heartening?
That is heartening, certainly. But as we also see in this report, with that escalation in extreme weather events and knowing what's coming down the line, we've still got a whole lot more to do. At the moment, we spend massively more on disaster recovery and cleaning up after these events than we do on proactively building the resilience of our communities, adapting our cities, our infrastructure to deal with worsening extreme weather. We've got to get on top of that. We have to be much more on the front foot, making sure we can deal with what's coming. But I say again, fundamentally, it's about getting our emissions down so that we are limiting future harms. And every fraction of the degree of avoided warming, every positive step is a little investment in a brighter, safer, more prosperous future for all of us.
Dr. Simon Bradshaw from the Climate Council and Climate-KIC, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Manny.